The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty streets of the small, quiet town. The kind of evening when everything feels still, too still. There's an odd sense in the air, something lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to be noticed. A flicker in the corner of your eye, a whisper in the wind. But when you look closer, there's nothing, just the ordinary piece of the world. Or so it seems. At the center of the town's only park stood a man, casually leaning against a tree, his broad form silhouetted against the orange sky. His posture was relaxed, yet there was an unmistakable intensity in his gaze. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, though not in his usual celebrity spotlight, still carried an aura of presence. He wasn't here for attention, but it didn't matter. People noticed him, but there was someone else too. Someone who hadn't seen him yet, but who was about to. Officer Cain, a man whose reputation preceded him, was making his rounds, scanning the park with cold, calculating eyes. He had dealt with trouble before, plenty of it, and he wasn't the kind to let anyone slip by unnoticed. As his boots echoed in the silence, he spotted him. The Rock. It wasn't just the man's stature that caught his attention, but something deeper, something unsettling, yet not immediately clear. With one deliberate step, Cain approached, and just like that, the tranquility of the evening shattered. The tension in the air thickened, the quiet of the park suddenly replaced by an impending sense of unease. What would happen next? Was it an ordinary encounter, or was something far more sinister unfolding? The calm of the day would not last, and the reason why would only become clear in the moments to come. Officer Cain approached with a calculated, deliberate stride. His boots clacked loudly against the concrete, the sound growing sharper as he closed the distance. The Rock could feel the weight of the officer's presence before he even spoke. He wasn't surprised. He'd experienced confrontations like this before, though never in such a calm setting. Cain's eyes were fixed, scanning him, sizing him up, almost as if he were looking for something wrong. "Hey!" Cain's voice cut through the air, low and cold. "You got ID?" The demand hung in the air, harsh and out of place in the serene atmosphere. His tone was dismissive, as though he already expected an answer he didn't like. There was something about his eyes, something judgmental. It wasn't just a request. Felt like an accusation. The Rock blinked, caught off guard by the sudden approach. For a split second, he didn't know how to respond. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just enjoying the park like everyone else. Still, he remained calm, choosing not to escalate the situation immediately. "I'm just here to enjoy the day, officer," he replied, his voice steady and calm, though there was a slight confusion in his words. "I don't see why I need to show any ID." Cain didn't like that answer. His stance grew more rigid, and his jaw tightened. "You don't belong here," he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for the Rock to catch. It was a low blow, but not unexpected. The officer's assumptions about who belonged in a place like this were clear, and they were already shaped by something more than just appearances. Cain took another step forward, his voice raising a notch. "You can't just walk around here acting like you own the place. I need to see your ID now," he snapped, his words sharp, edged with something far less professional than they should have been. The Rock stood tall, unfazed. He wasn't intimidated. "I have every right to be here," he said firmly, his eyes locking with Cain's. "I'm not going to show you anything. You have no reason to ask." Cain's patience started to thin. His face reddened, and he spoke with more force, almost spitting his words. "You think you can just defy me? I'm telling you, show me your ID or leave." His tone was thick with condescension, as though he were speaking to someone beneath him. The Rock didn't flinch. He wasn't going anywhere. Frustration radiated from Officer Cain as the tension between him and the Rock reached a boiling point. His face, already flushed with anger, twisted into something darker, more impatient. His fingers tightened around the baton hanging at his side, as if it was the only way to regain control of the situation. With a swift, sudden motion, Cain drew the baton and, in one explosive action, swung it toward the Rock. The crack of the baton against the rock's arm echoed in the still air. It was loud, jarring, and violent. The crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath, eyes wide with shock. A few people gasped, some even pulling out their phones, recording the unexpected escalation. The peaceful park atmosphere quickly shifted into something tense and hostile. The once calm surroundings now felt charged, as if everyone instinctively knew this moment would change everything. But the Rock didn't flinch. His body remained rigid, his face unflappable. The baton had struck his arm, but it didn't seem to faze him. He stood tall, his posture unwavering, a look of cold, controlled calm in his eyes. The crowd around him couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Cain, on the other hand, was still seething, not understanding how his strike had no effect. "Big mistake, tough guy," Cain growled, his voice dripping with arrogance. He believed that his authority and aggression would break the Rock, force him into submission. But what Cain didn't realize was that his assumptions were all wrong. The Rock didn't respond with words. Instead, in one swift movement, he reached out, his hand closing around the baton. In a fluid motion, he twisted it from Cain's grip, effortlessly disarming him. The baton was now in the Rock's hands, a symbol of his physical power and calm control. The crowd went silent for a moment, unsure of what they had just seen. Cain stood there, stunned, unable to comprehend the ease with which the Rock had taken control of the situation. His breath quickened, the realization slowly dawning on him. He was completely out of his depth. His earlier bravado now seemed foolish. His baton, his only tool of power, was now a mere object in the hands of the very person he had underestimated. The crowd began to murmur, sensing the shift in the air. They saw it too, the change in the power dynamic. The Rock was no longer the passive target of Cain's anger. He was in control now. The officer's arrogance had only led him to a humbling moment. And as Cain's eyes flickered from the baton in the Rock's hand to the Rock's unblinking gaze, he understood that he was no longer the one calling the shots. The park, which moments ago had been a place of calm and leisure, was now filled with an electric tension. The atmosphere hung thick with anticipation, the crowd unsure of what would happen next. Would Cain back down? Or would his bruised ego push him to escalate the situation further? Cain's ego, once towering, crumbled before the eyes of the crowd. His mind raced, trying to find a way to regain control of the situation. The humiliation stung deeply. His hands trembled as he reached for his sidearm, desperate to assert his authority again. The weapon, the symbol of his power, seemed like the only option left. He thought that drawing his gun would intimidate the Rock, force him into submission. But before he could even fully unholster it, the Rock moved. Swift, confident, and in complete control, the Rock reached out and grabbed Cain's wrist with a grip so strong it felt like a vice. Cain tried to pull away, but it was futile. The Rock's fingers locked around his wrist, and with a swift twist, Cain felt his hand being forced open. The gun dropped to the ground with a dull clink, powerless in the Rock's presence. For a brief moment, Cain stood there, disoriented. His sidearm was gone, stripped away like his dignity. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. The Rock didn't even flinch. He remained calm, his eyes unwavering as they met Cain's. "Think twice before you act again," the Rock said in a low, controlled voice. His words weren't shouted in anger, but they carried an undeniable weight. There was no question that the Rock had the upper hand, and it was clear now that there was no way Cain could win this confrontation. The officer's shoulders slumped, his bravado evaporating in an instant. The crowd, who had been holding their breath, now released a collective sigh of relief. They had witnessed something extraordinary, something that no one had expected. And then, as if on cue, a cheer broke out. Applause echoed through the park, followed by shouts of approval. "That's what justice looks like," someone yelled from the back, and the crowd roared in agreement. Cain, once standing tall in his uniform, now looked small. His face, flushed with anger just moments ago, was now drained of color. His knees buckled slightly, and he took an unsteady step back, trying to regain his composure. But it was too late. His arrogance had led him into a trap, and now he stood as a humiliated figure, stripped of his pride and authority. The Rock remained composed, standing firm, unbothered by the spectacle unfolding around him. He had shown everyone present exactly what real strength and control looked like. And Cain? He was just another man brought to his knees. The tense air, thick with anticipation, suddenly shifted as the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance. Within moments, 2 squad cars screeched to a halt, their lights flashing brightly. The officers inside quickly stepped out, their expressions focused and serious. However, as they laid eyes on the scene before them, their bodies froze in place. Standing tall, dominating the situation, was the Rock, towering over Cain, who was still trying to regain his footing. The 2 officers exchanged a glance, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The Rock, effortlessly calm and composed, stood with his arms crossed, eyes steady. It was as though he had been expecting them, and their arrival didn't faze him at all. But the same could not be said for the officers. One of them, an older man, seemed to recognize the Rock instantly. His eyes widened, and his stern expression softened. The moment was fleeting, but it was enough to change the mood of the situation. Well, look who we have here," the officer said, his voice lighter now. "Didn't expect to see you involved in something like this." There was a touch of respect in his tone, almost like a nod of acknowledgement to the man who stood unflinching in front of them. The Rock's response was calm, collected. "I'm just making sure things stay right," he said, a small nod as he addressed the officer's change of attitude. His presence was commanding, and the way he carried himself made it clear that he wasn't just another bystander. He had become the authority in this moment. Cain, still reeling from his earlier humiliation, glanced from the officers to the Rock in disbelief. His mind couldn't process what was happening. His usual arrogance had faded, replaced with a growing frustration. The officers, the ones who were supposed to back him up, were now exchanging pleasantries with the very man who had just destroyed his sense of control. Cain clenched his fists, trying to regain some of the authority he had lost, but his words came out weak. "What's going on here?" he barked, trying to put on a show of strength, but his voice cracked slightly. His attempts to act tough were in vain. The power dynamic had shifted beyond his ability to control it. The Rock turned his attention to both the officers and the growing crowd. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice carrying a sense of purpose. "It's about standing up for what's right. No one should be made to feel small just because of the way they look or who they are." His words rang out, a reminder to everyone that sometimes standing up for what's right takes more than just physical strength. It requires integrity and courage. The crowd, once filled with tension, now buzzed with approval. They had witnessed something rare. The Rock wasn't just addressing the situation. He was giving a lesson in respect and humanity. The senior officer, who had been watching everything unfold quietly, finally stepped forward. With a heavy sigh, he turned to Cain. "That's enough," he said, his voice filled with finality. Without hesitation, he unbuckled Cain's badge and holstered gun and handed them over to one of the other officers. The crowd erupted into cheers, the sense of justice palpable in the air. Cain stood there, stunned. The weight of his actions, the cruelty, the arrogance, had finally caught up to him. As he was escorted away by the officers, his career, reputation, and sense of authority were in tatters. He had learned the hardest of lessons that day. The camera lingered on his face, a mix of disbelief and regret, as he disappeared into the squad car. His fall from grace was complete, and the world had watched it unfold. As the dust settled and the last few murmurs of the crowd died down, a young boy, no more than 10, nervously approached the Rock. His eyes were wide with admiration, and in his hands, he held a piece of paper and a marker, hoping for an autograph. The scene, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now shifted to a moment of quiet humanity. The Rock turned and saw the boy, his expression softening instantly. He knelt down, offering the boy a warm smile. "Hey there," he said gently, taking the paper and marker from the boy's trembling hands. You look like you've got something to say. The boy's eyes lit up. I want to thank you, he stammered, for standing up to him. You showed us what a real hero is. The Rock's smile grew wider. He handed the paper back, signed, and then ruffled the boy's hair. It's not about being a hero, kid. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's hard. Always stand up for what's right, no matter the consequences. Around them, the crowd, which had once been caught up in the chaos, now gathered in silence. Respect and admiration filled the air as people began to nod and murmur their appreciation for the calm strength they had witnessed. Even the police officers, who had witnessed everything firsthand, approached the Rock, expressing their gratitude for his composure under pressure. As the Rock stood up and began to walk away, his figure silhouetted against the setting sun, he turned for one final moment to speak. Always remember, be kind, be strong, and most importantly, always do the right thing. With that, the Rock walked off into the horizon, a man who had not only faced adversity but had shown others the path to dignity and honor.